Welcome to the Holocaust and the Journey of the Soul for International Holocaust Remembrance Day 2022. All of you watching tonight are on the front lines in the battle against Holocaust forgetfulness. Your participation combats the twin enemies of ignorance and apathy. Recent studies in America and England have revealed that ignorance about the Holocaust is widespread in the general population. Even the younger generation of Jews is woefully lacking in real understanding of the catastrophe that overtook Europe just 8 decades ago. A more insidious problem is apathy, the phenomenon known as Holocaust fatigue. The sense of, I've heard enough stories of tragedy. Let the Holocaust find its place in the pages of the history books. It doesn't speak to me today. We have put together this program as an antidote to Holocaust fatigue. The Holocaust devastated the Jewish people, killing a third of us and traumatizing all of us. On a national level, the Jewish people has rebounded, displaying in Israel and in the diaspora unparalleled energy, creativity, and commitment to life. But what about the individual level? Is there a way for the individual soul to transform trauma into triumph? Tonight, we will share with you stories of such souls who, through their own diligent efforts, faced their Holocaust-haunted past and achieved healing. They engaged in a process of turning fear into courage, despair into hope, hatred into love. We trust their stories will be eye-opening and heart-expanding for you, and that they will leave you feeling enlightened and inspired. Now it is my honor to introduce our distinguished guest, the Hungarian ambassador to the United Nations, Her Excellency Zsuzsanna Horvat.
Thank you very much. And I would like to start by saying how grateful I am to be with you tonight. So, ladies and gentlemen, let me start by confessing that it has always been heart-wrenching for me to speak on this occasion, as 6 million souls have fallen prey to the dreadful decision made by the Nazis at the Wannsee Conference 80 years ago. The Holocaust defies imagination. Every Jew was a target, including 1.5 million children. They were pursued for only one reason: they were Jews. And according to Adolf Hitler's demented worldview, all Jews had to be eliminated. I will speak to you about my journey as an ambassador to the UN, which journey is somehow intertwined with Israel, the memory of the Holocaust, and Hungary's fight against anti-Semitism. At the time, when the modern Jewish state was finally born in 1947, Hungary, controlled by the Soviet Union and the communist regime, has not yet been a member of the United Nations. However, Hungary has since become a committed member of the UN and an especially strong voice when it comes to defending Israel on the international fora. When I was invited to visit Israel in December last year, I witnessed with my own eyes how this country has to fight for its mere existence day after day. During the Holocaust, there was no Israel. Had there been, I was wondering how many Jews might have found safe haven when so many countries around the world shamefully turned their back on the fate of Jews, desperate to escape. My story started back in 2014 when I became ambassador to the UN in Geneva. As you may know, Geneva hosts the Human Rights Council, the primary body of the UN monitoring human rights worldwide, while New York is the home of the Security Council and the General Assembly, which discuss matters of peace and security. When I arrived to Geneva, I was taken aback by the obvious injustice and bias. I was confronted for the first time with an international community that is still, to this day, prejudiced against the State of Israel. At the Human Rights Council, among the 10 items on the agenda, one whole item, item 7, is dedicated to criticism against Israel, with 5 resolutions adopted from year to year. This compares to only 1 resolution on countries with the worst human rights violations, such as Syria or the Democratic People's Republic of Korea. The Human Rights Council holds no fewer than 3 regular sessions a year. If 1/3 of its member states request so, it can decide to hold a special session to address human rights violations and emergencies. Throughout the history of the Human Rights Council, it convened 33 special sessions, and 9 of them was devoted to condemning Israel. And all this has been happening in a council that always includes members with highly questionable human rights records themselves. After fighting for a fair treatment for Israel for 6 years in Geneva, I started my mandate as an ambassador to the UN in New York in February last year. Upon my arrival, I had to take note again that a highly disproportionate number of resolutions of the General Assembly, 11 from year to year, are dedicated to condemning Israel. Thankfully, we are also able to join forces and stand up for Israel and anti-Semitism at the UN. In Geneva, Hungary was among those who initiated the first ever statement against anti-Semitism. In New York, the General Assembly adopted on 20th January a resolution against the denial of the Holocaust. Upon the initiative of Israel and with the sponsorship of Hungary and more than 100 other member states. This is a historic step. The first UN resolution entirely dedicated to this topic. It establishes the definition of Holocaust denial as set out by the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance. The resolution also draws attention to the growing threat of anti-Semitism, the denial or distortion of the Holocaust in the online sphere, which we unfortunately see resurfacing today. The Hungarian government has introduced a zero-tolerance policy against anti-Semitism, racism, and xenophobia. Our fundamental law establishes the prohibitions against hate speech, establishing that freedom of expression cannot be used to violate the dignity of any national, ethnic, racial, or religious community. Incitement or violence against a community or its members is a crime, punishable by up to 3 years of imprisonment. While we see an alarming increase in attack against the Jewish community in Western Europe and the United States, Hungary is a safe haven for them. The government has also been supporting Jewish culture and the preservation of Jewish heritage sites, including the renovation of the Jewish cemeteries, reconstruction of synagogues, as well as the cultural heritage and artwork in the property of the Jewish community. It is crucial to keep the memory of the Holocaust high on the agenda at the United Nations and beyond. As the war's liberators, eyewitnesses, and survivors succumb to age, there is less and less people who would be able to tell us their stories and keep the memory of the Holocaust alive. Who, if not us, will carry the enduring lessons of the Holocaust in a world desperately in need of daily reminders? Those victims don't even have the dignity of graves. They only have us. And without us, who will remember not only their tragic fate, but also the vibrancy of their lives? We cannot allow another such genocide to happen. We cannot let people to be discriminated, persecuted based on their religion or belief, based on their ethnicity or the color of their skin. Ladies and gentlemen, it is a very personal mission that I carry within me, that I'm sharing with you today. The mission to combat anti-Israel bias at the UN and advocate for the truth about the Holocaust, about anti-Semitism in the face of the denial and distortion that we bear witness to day after day. This is not an easy mission, and sometimes I feel alone in this fight, but I do believe that I'm at the best place to do it. I thank you once again for having me among you today, and let me be inspired by your stories and insights. I thank you.
Thank you, Your Excellency, Ambassador Horvat. Lily Ebert wrote how she made a promise to herself in Auschwitz. If I ever came out of that place, I was determined to do something that would change everything. I had to make sure that nothing like this could ever happen again to anybody. So I promised myself I would tell the world what had happened, not just to me, but to all the people who could not tell their stories. Now, nearly 8 decades later, 98-year-old Lily has fulfilled that promise many times over. After years of working to educate people about the Holocaust, she has told her remarkable story in Lily's Promise, How I Survived Auschwitz and Found the Strength to Live. Lily is a social media star who has 1.3 million TikTok followers, but she is even prouder that she has 3 children, 10 grandchildren, and as of last week, 35 great-grandchildren. Upon revisiting Auschwitz, Lily said, I went into Auschwitz when I wanted, and I didn't go alone. I went with my children and grandchildren. I came in because I wanted to. I won.
My name is Lily Ebert. I am an Auschwitz Holocaust survivor. Now, to speak about something, what it is really impossible, I will try to do it. I went through the worst situation in life where anybody could go through. Auschwitz-Birkenau. I lost my mother, brother, sister. I don't lost my father, luckily there, because he luckily died before. And I thank God for that. But I lost who's the most important in every human being alive: mother, sister, brother, and uncles, aunties, hundreds of my family. And I am even so, now when I say my story, I thank God. Thank that I am here. I am here for my family and can tell the world, never, even so, never lost faith. Because I know it is very difficult to live. But without faith, it would be impossible. Faith, you think, you can, I heard a few times, how can you have faith? But I answer, with faith, it is difficult to survive. Without faith, it is impossible. Physically, maybe you survive, but mentally, you can't. So faith really helped me to survive. And I thank God that I have a nice family. I have children, grandchildren, great-grandchildren. All of them, thank God, good human beings. And that is what I get. How? Of course it hurts that I have not my parents who could not enjoy with their grandchildren, their great-grandchildren. It hurts. But I am here. I had a family, and it carries on the life. And I thank God for that. Because not we made the world. The world is made for us. And I thank God for that.
Thank you, Lily Ebert, for setting the tone of tonight's program with that message of hope. Sara Rigler is the author of 6 books on Jewish spirituality. An international lecturer, she has lectured on 5 continents and in over 35 American cities. Born in the Philadelphia area to second-generation American parents, she has had a lifelong obsession with the Holocaust, which led her to spend 8 years researching and writing her new book, I've Been Here Before, When Souls of the Holocaust Return.
The greatest obstacle to remembering the Holocaust is, I have learned, Holocaust fatigue. People are tired of hearing about the horrors of the Holocaust, the suffering of the victims, the cruelty of the perpetrators. Yet 4 years ago, a Holocaust book broke through the Holocaust fatigue barrier and became an international bestseller. Edith Eger's memoir, called The Choice, sold 350,000 copies and was translated into 7 languages. How did that happen? Edith recounts the horrors she experienced, her being taken to Auschwitz at the age of 16, the murder of both her parents, the beatings, starvation, and degradation she endured, the death march, and how at liberation, when an American soldier pulled her out of a pile of bodies, she weighed 70 pounds and had a broken back. But the book also tells about her soul journey after the Holocaust, about her struggles to relinquish anger and fear, and about the arduous process she went through to attain inner freedom. 70 years after the Holocaust, she wrote, "What happened can never be forgotten and can never be changed. But over time, I learned that I can choose how to respond to the past. I can be miserable or I can be hopeful. I can be depressed or I can be happy. We always have that choice." In her own life, she embarked on a journey of greater self-awareness, greater self-acceptance, and greater love for herself and others. Victor Hugo said, "What makes night within us may leave stars." Survivors like Edith and Lily Ebert became great people through their suffering, not in spite of it. Edith called it the gift in the trauma. She wrote, "Auschwitz was the place where I discovered my inner resources." Throughout her life, by utilizing those inner resources, she became a person of great heart and great wisdom, which she shares in her book. She writes, "I live to guide others to a position of empowerment in the face of all of life's hardships." This is the journey of the soul. The process of taking our experiences and using them as the raw materials to create a life of meaning and purpose, to turn our fears into courage, our selfishness into compassion, our dishonesty into truthfulness. Judaism calls this process rectification or tikkun. We may be familiar with the term tikkun in terms of rectifying the world, tikkun olam. But I learned through my own involvement in political activism that no one can improve the world until they first improve themselves. The proponents of lofty visions are often brought down by their own pettiness and selfishness. First, we each must commit to the process of personal rectification, what Judaism calls tikkun atzmi, to achieve our own personal nobility before we can actualize our noble vision for humanity. This is the journey of the soul. Although none of us has experienced the total loss, home, possessions, family, health, dignity that Edith Eger and Lily Ebert experienced, we have all experienced challenges in our lives. We too are on a soul journey that presents us with choices between despair and hope, between anger and acceptance, between hatred and love, between being the victim of other people's maliciousness and being the victor over our own negative responses. And more, as more and more survivors pass away, is the Holocaust receding into the past? Surprisingly, I have discovered that it is not. I spent 8 years researching and writing about a mysterious phenomenon, that there are many, many people born after 1945 to families with no connection to the Holocaust, who, even as young children, have experienced recurrent dreams, flashbacks, panic attacks, and phobias with specific Holocaust content. Most of my research subjects were born within the first decade and a half after the Holocaust, a period when there were no movies and very few books about the Holocaust. A third of them were born to non-Jewish families where the Holocaust was never mentioned. So how does a 4-year-old born in 1950 in New York have nightly visions of standing in the back of a truck crowded with women, most of them collapsing to the floor? It would be 2 decades until this girl learned that the Nazis' earliest experiment in mass murder was to lock people into the back of a truck and pipe the carbon monoxide gas from the motor into the back of the truck. How does a 9-year-old child in Los Angeles get sick with fever and have a dream in which, as she described it to me, I was tossed into a pile of bodies and was too weak to move? More bodies were put on top of me, and after being unable to move from under them, my soul left my body. She had no way of knowing that feverish prisoners being tossed into piles of bodies when they were not yet dead was a common occurrence in the concentration camps. How does a Jewish man born in Brooklyn in 1970 to a family with no direct connection to the Holocaust have not only Holocaust-related dreams from childhood until the present, but also have a disconcerting Holocaust flashback when he was 18 years old? A flashback is unlike a memory. A memory is inside our head. In a flashback, we are inside the memory, actually reliving it. As he described to me, I was in an auto repair shop with a friend of mine. The sound of the impact wrench removing a wheel from a car triggered off a memory of my death. In the flashback, I was standing around a very large pit with a group of people. Some military men were standing with machine guns in the background. I tried not to look around and felt very exhausted, but I knew that my life was about to end. I saw very tall trees in the forest with leaves on the top. These trees weren't like any that I've seen growing up in America. The temperature was pleasant with good weather, like summertime. Suddenly, one officer said 3 words in a foreign language that I wasn't able to understand. I would assume he said, Ready, aim, fire. The officers holding machine guns started to fire in sequence from far right-hand corner of the pit, then continued along the pit to the left. I was somewhere in the middle or the left. People being shot in the back of the head were falling forward into the pit, and I knew that it would be my turn in a matter of seconds. As soon as he got up to me, I felt very lightheaded with a dizzy feeling, then started to fall forward head first into the pit, just like everybody else. When I was falling forward, everything started to get dark until it was completely dark. At this point, I came out of my flashback, and my friend was next to me. He was looking at me the whole time and tried to talk to me, but I hadn't responded. He asked me what was wrong, and I said that I didn't know, and I couldn't explain it. For years, I was very puzzled by this flashback. I didn't understand it. How does a 4-year-old child born in Whangarei, New Zealand, to Pentecostal Christian parents, a child who knew no Jews and nothing about Judaism, announced to her parents, "I don't eat ham, and I don't eat bacon, and the real day of rest is Saturday, not Sunday." After insisting on seeing the video Escape from Sobibor at the age of 9, how is this child plagued with recurrent Holocaust nightmares that last not for weeks, as any Holocaust movie would do, but for years? Why was she so obsessed with the Holocaust and with Judaism that at the age of 17, still not having met a single Jew, she boarded a plane for Israel? The answer, according to Judaism, is that she is a Jewish soul. And the soul carries with it the imprints of its past lives. You may be surprised to learn that Judaism has a concept of past lives called Gilgul Neshamot, the recycling of souls. This concept, passed down during millennia through Judaism's esoteric tradition called Kabbalah, is an inherent part of Judaism's concept of an immortal soul that outlives the death of the body. We may think of ourselves as a body possessing a soul, but according to Jewish tradition, the opposite is true. Each of us is a soul wearing a body. And like we take off our garments at the end of each day, so we take off our body at the end of this life. And the soul returns to the spiritual realm from which it came, what Judaism calls the world of souls. The purpose of life is personal rectification. This is not a selfish endeavor. The process of rectification, or tikkun atzmi, always requires becoming less selfish, more focused on the needs of others, more kind, more generous, more loving. Every soul has its own unique tikkun. Working toward it or not is the journey of the soul. But what about a well-meaning person who does not achieve tikkun in this lifetime? Perhaps someone who dies young, or whose life is cut short by being killed, or someone who progressed but not far enough? God in his mercy gives the soul many chances to get it right. As the sage Rabbi Moshe Chaim Luzzatto explained in his classic, The Way of God, God arranged matters so that man's chances of achieving ultimate salvation should be maximized. A single soul can be reincarnated a number of times in different bodies, and in this manner, it can rectify the damage done in previous incarnations. Similarly, it can also achieve perfection that was not attained in its previous incarnations. In my new book, When Souls of the Holocaust Return, it's called I've Been Here Before, When Souls of the Holocaust Return, I devote a chapter to explicating the Jewish concept of reincarnation. For our purposes tonight, suffice it to say that reincarnation appears to be the only logical explanation for the widespread phenomenon that I discovered in my 8 years of research. Some 450 people answered my online survey, and another 100 wrote me emails detailing their personal experiences of dreams, flashbacks, phobias with specific Holocaust content. All of them had a lifelong obsession with the Holocaust. All of them were embarrassed to admit their experiences, not wanting to be deemed weird. All of them thought that they were the only one. Turns out that this is a widespread phenomenon. Some of you listening tonight may be reincarnated souls of the Holocaust, but for sure, all of you have a good friend or relative who is and is just not telling you about it. 2 months after my book came out, I received an email from a Dr. Rosen who had read the book. She wrote that she was amazed by the book because she for years had a recurring Holocaust dream, and she thought she was the only one. But what really flabbergasted her was the account of Dr. Sara Levy. Now, Dr. Sara Levy's recurring dream of Nazis trying to break down her door while she tried to find a place to hide, it was no extraordinary dream. But I included it in my book because Dr. Levy has a PhD in neuropsychology and is an associate professor at the City University of New York Graduate Center. And she's published peer-reviewed research in scientific journals. So she's clearly not a crackpot. And unlike most of my research subjects, she actually allowed me to use her real name. But why was Dr. Rosen so astounded by the account of Sara Levy's recurrent dream? As Dr. Rosen wrote to me, what was so surprising about Sara Levy? Sara described the same dream that I've been having all these years. Why was this so shocking to me? Sara is one of my oldest and dearest friends, and I only knew about her dream through your book. Sara's dream, after discussing it with her on the phone tonight, she put in parentheses, is exactly the same as mine. All the details match perfectly. In addition, she continued, Dr. Rosen continued in her letter, we both find the need to look for an appropriate and safe hiding place whenever we move into a new house. My husband and I built our home in Atlanta. In the house, I specifically had a secret room built under my staircase as my hiding place. Sara told me tonight that when they recently built the home they're living in now, she specifically told the architect to include a small crawl space under the staircase as her hiding place. Dr. Rosen ends her letter. I guess Sara and I are what you would describe as meeting again. How weird it was to me to find out such similarities with an old friend only through your book. Most of my research subjects were plagued by a smaller or lesser degree by the shadow of their Holocaust trauma. They were triggered by hearing the German language or by trains or by seeing blonde-haired men in uniform, even passport control agents at the airport. The question arises, does consciousness alone heal? If a person discovers that they are likely a reincarnated soul from the Holocaust, does that awareness cure them of their trauma? If a person who has fears of showers, who's perfectly okay with baths and swimming pools, but has a phobia of showers, comes to understand the root of this phobia is that the gas chambers were made to look like showers, is that awareness enough to heal the trauma? Many therapists indeed say that consciousness alone heals. But when we look at survivors like Lily Eber and Edith Eger and see how hard they worked to become the great people they became, we learn another lesson. That the goal is not just to neutralize the trauma by banishing it from memory. Rather, the goal is to transform the trauma, to use it as grist for the mill of tikkun, rectification. This takes deliberate spiritual work. F.M. Swirsky is a therapist in Jerusalem who employs an effective method of dealing with trauma at its root. He helps his subjects enter into a state of deep relaxation and then spends at least the first hour surrounding the subject with the healing light and love of God. When the subject actually sees or relives the past trauma, Swirsky guides the subject to eliminate the trauma with spiritual principles. After the patient re-experiences a traumatic death, Swirsky guides the victim to go what he calls up with the soul to the spiritual realms. Swirsky regressed a Russian-born Jewish woman living in Israel. She went back to a lifetime in the Holocaust. She reported that she was going to the gas chambers. Feeling totally broken by the Nazis, she said, they can do anything they want. She was totally depressed. As Swirsky describes the end of the session, you could see on her face that she was depressed. I took her through her death in the gas chambers. I told her, just go out of your body as it goes down on the floor. You could see that as she went out of the body, her face changed and there was a big smile. I asked her, why are you smiling? She replied, over there, I had the total feeling that they won. Now I feel like they lost. A similar method of spiritually transcending the trauma is practiced by Swirsky's associate, Sasha Alexander Friedman, as described in the following case. Leah was born to a Jewish family in France in 1985. From a young age, she had a phobia of trains. Many of my research subjects had a phobia of trains. At 19, Leah married and went to live in Israel. She remembers. I was constantly imagining where I would hide in case the Nazis would come. I would think of a hiding place and then think it was not good enough and that they would find me. I was also afraid when my husband went out, I was afraid he would not come back. Leah also experienced physical pain when engaged in intimacy with her husband. She says, I went to many doctors and nothing helped me until a doctor said it was psychological. Then I went to a woman who specialized in energy healing. When she reached the sexual area, I was in an alpha state, and I saw two images in my mind, one of a Nazi soldier and the other of Rabbi Elchanan Wasserman, who's a famous rabbi who lived in Baranovich, Poland. I felt tremendous pain and started to cry. I understood that I was there. I had no relief of my symptoms from this. But then 2 years later, I went to see Sasha Alexander Friedman, who specializes in trauma. He would lead me into a deep relaxation state, would ask about my emotions, how I felt them and which color they were. He had me imagine the light of God entering all of my body. I came to a black dot that was deeply rooted in my heart. He asked me to open it. Then I remembered everything. That I was a 17-year-old girl who lived in Baranovich. And then I remembered the scene of being raped by a Nazi soldier. I relived the trauma and cried a lot. Then Sasha helped me heal the pain. He told me to shine the light of God on the Nazi until he disappeared. Then he did other exercises. I had 2 sessions with him. After the first, the memory of the pain was tremendous, and I felt tremendously sad. After the second session, my symptoms disappeared immediately and permanently. Whether or not you are a reincarnated soul of the Holocaust, according to the greatest Jewish mystic, Rabbi Isaac Luria, known as the Arizal, all of us are reincarnated souls. The Arizal said in the 16th century that there are no new souls coming into the world. We are all old souls. We all have fears, attractions, repulsions, and affinities that are inexplicable in the context of our parents and environment. While there may be other explanations, I believe that understanding that we carry within us the imprint of our past lives can make us more comprehensible to ourselves and more compassionate toward others. We're all back here in this world in order to effect our tikkun, our unique tikkun. Hearing the stories of those who have worked on their tikkun and accomplished it, whether survivors like Lily Eber and Edith Eger, or the people in my book, should inspire us in our own soul journeys. Here's a true story. Sara David was born in New York in 1965 to a Jewish family with no connection to the Holocaust. While in her 30s, she found herself having to fly frequently from Florida to Chicago. Sara had traveled all over the world, especially to Israel, where she had taken Israeli citizenship at the age of 18. She had always loved flying, but at this point in her life, she developed a mysterious phobia. When she would stand in the jetway waiting to board the plane, she would have a panic attack, feeling that she was standing in line to enter the gas chamber. as she told me. I was sure that we were all going to die entering that box, that giant boxcar of bodies, and yet I couldn't warn anyone nor stop it. I got sick, shook uncontrollably with my heart racing, crying and fainting. But I kept flying because my children depended on it. I asked everyone for help. I took pills to relax. Nothing really helped. On the flight that would prove to be a turning point in her life, Sara was sitting in her assigned seat in the back of the plane before takeoff. A kind flight attendant, seeing her panic, asked if he could help her. Gazing at all the people in front of her, whom she saw as soon to be dead bodies, she told the flight attendant that it would help if she could sit closer to the front of the plane. Soon the flight attendant returned and informed her that there was a seat for her in first class, that a generous couple sitting there, hearing of her need, had invited her to sit with them. Sara made her way forward and the attendant showed her where to sit. The couple were German, clearly wealthy and in their 70s. Sara keenly felt their social superiority to her, how they, of what she called the German elite, had deigned to help her, the needy passenger from economy class. Sara sat next to the woman, who benignly tried to help her relax by engaging her in pleasant conversation, asking her about the best spas, golf courses, and shopping areas in Florida. Sara related what happened next. I started to get involved in the conversation, but was still reeling with fear and dizziness. Then she took out a book to read, first asking me if I had a book of my own to read. I did. I pulled out 9 Gates to the Hasidic Mysteries by Jiri Langer. And I proceeded to answer her polite interest in its subject matter. I told her that it is a travel log from pre-World War II of an assimilated Czech Jew who traveled east in order to understand the spirituality of the Hasidim of Eastern Europe. Her response stunned me. She said, "The Jewish people are unbelievable, how once again they're rising in power to destroy the world and all its progress, just as they had nearly done to Germany." With that blatant expression of German anti-Semitism, Sara blacked out for a few moments. When she regained consciousness, she felt like she had died and come back. She was aware that this was no chance encounter. God had arranged this meeting, this face-to-face encounter with a high-ranking Jew-hating German, in order to give her an opportunity to do what she had failed to do in her previous lifetime. She faced a choice. She could shrink away and obsequiously return to her seat in economy, or she could stand up and defend her people. She suddenly became aware that she was not a Jew overpowered by the Third Reich, about to die. She was alive and had, through the shadowy mists of time, survived as a Jew in a new place and a new period. She was not a prisoner of her past. She broke through the bars of her fear and was free. With this realization came another that switched their roles. She had thought that this wealthy German woman was the benefactor and she was the almost submissive recipient of her largesse. But once liberated from her fear, Sara sensed a new mission, as she told me. Although it might appear that this woman was here to help me, I suddenly felt that truly I was here to help her. She had a soul buried in such darkness. She had been living in complete darkness and evil lies her entire life. Comfortable, luxurious darkness, to be sure, just as her noble family's evil lies in history in Germany went back generations. Yet she was actually somewhat engaged in dialogue with me on that flight in first class, thanks to her generosity toward my neediness at that time. Her soul had reached out toward mine. I had to reach into her worldview and open her eyes to my truth. I told her she was mistaken. I told her that I was Jewish and Israeli. I told her about all the gifts she enjoys daily that are thanks to Israeli inventiveness. I told her about the loving kindness and sweet simplicity revealed in the book I was reading about Jews in Europe before World War II. Well, the German woman was, of course, shocked, but she remained polite. She had no idea she had invited a Jew to sit next to her. She remained polite and she listened to Sara's assertions and she argued with them. Sara stood her ground. She defended the Jewish people in Israel. Apparently, Sara won the argument because the German woman promised to find the book in German in order to read it. But Sara also won in a more significant way. After this encounter, her fear of flying totally disappeared. Her healing was complete. From that day on, she became a less fearful person. This is tikkun. Now, I've been talking about the victims, but what about the bystanders? What happens when they reincarnate? Junie Maggio was born into a Catholic family in Prairie City, a suburb of Kansas City, Missouri, in 1952. Prairie Village was, as Junie describes it, where all the ethnic people lived. Her neighborhood was 80% Jewish, and all of Junie's friends were Jewish. When she was in first grade in Catholic school, the Monsignor consigned Julie to hell because she had committed the mortal sin of missing a Sunday Mass. Junie remembers, I reasoned that since the church taught that all others who were not Christian were going to hell, I would be together with all the Jews from the neighborhood and all would be well for me. My Jewish friends would love me in hell and I would be okay. Although no one in her neighborhood talked about the Holocaust. Starting from an early age and throughout her life, Junie has been obsessed with the subject. This obsession was accompanied by a feeling of guilt. As she described it, I just had this hatred for all things German. The very words Germany, Nazi, Hitler, the sight of the swastika would send shivers up my spine. I could not abide the word concentration because to me it meant concentration camp. I have been this way all of my life. I think about the Holocaust often, sometimes daily. Whereas I have Jewish friends who think like I do in this context, I have never met another Gentile who thinks and feels the way I do. I do remember feeling guilty when I was little for being alive and for living in a wonderful home with nice parents, friends, and a wonderful neighborhood. I felt so ashamed that I lived while millions had died. I remember looking up at the crucifix over my bed and I told Jesus on the cross, had I lived then, I would not have stayed silent. I would have done something. I know I would have done something to help. I felt deep, deep guilt and terrible shame in being alive and having a good life. All of my life, my mantra was, if I had lived then, I would have done something to help. The tikkun that would wipe away Julie's guilt for presumably failing to save lives during the Holocaust presented itself when she was 42 years old. She read an article entitled A Question of Duty, written by Stephen Mosher. As Junie relates, the article was about the methodical killing of unwanted baby girls due to China's one-child policy. There was an editorial comment at the end of the article which said something to the effect of, reports of the widespread killing of infant baby girls is like the scattered reports coming out of Europe in 1938 about the methodical killing of Jews. My blood ran cold. My immediate thought was, this is my chance. I will not be silent. I will intervene. I will help. And so I adopted my first daughter from China in 1996 and my second one in 2001. After adopting her Chinese daughters, literally saving their lives, Junie's lifelong guilt ebbed away. A failure to act can be rectified by action. This is tikkun. The Holocaust was a terrible, terrible chapter ending, but it was not the end of the story for any soul. You might be wondering, do I have to know what happened in my past life? The answer is no. God in his mercy will give you the opportunities you need in this life to rectify your mistakes and your negative character traits. But for some people, their past impinges on their present life with a fury. And their soul journey requires tremendous courage and fortitude. And that's our next speaker, Yael Shahar.
Thank you, Sara. Yael Shahar was born to a non-Jewish family in Texas, but moved to Israel on her own as a teenager. She has trained horses, taught physics, and hiked the length and breadth of Israel. She served as a police sniper in Israel's border guard and in the reserves in a hostage rescue unit. And that's just the part that she's allowed to talk about. Most of her career has been in counterterrorism and intelligence. Yael Shahar is the author of Returning, a remarkable true story of spiritual resilience in the wake of Holocaust trauma.
Thank you, Howard. I'm going to say at the outset that I'm something of a skeptic with regard to Gilgul Neshamot, to reincarnation, and yet these memories are real and they're widespread. What's more, they appear to be nothing new. You might be surprised to learn that Jewish tradition has words for at least 3 different types of inherited memory. And like the purported numerous Eskimo words for snow, this seems to indicate that inherited memory has popped up repeatedly throughout Jewish history. So I would like to take you on a journey into an inherited memory, my own. I'm 9 years old. I wake up with a start, cold sweat on my skin, a startled scream choked off by returning consciousness. Only a dream, only a dream. The next morning at breakfast, my mother glances at me and looks again with concern. It happened again, didn't it? The dream, you look. She doesn't say it this time, but I've heard her say it before when she thought I wasn't listening. Haunted, haunted, a ghost haunting my own body. These aren't my hands, the fingernails clean and trimmed. The crease is barely there, clear of the soot and ash that I know is there when what? I grasp after the fleeting memory, needing something to hold on to give substance to the reality that I know was there behind my eyes that now behold their own alien hands, uncomprehending. The years pass, and I grow used to the dislocations and interruptions. The dreams remain. I never really grow used to them, but I learn to live with the nightly intrusions of that other reality. By now, I'm old enough to know that they aren't real and that they're some distorted version of reality, which thankfully exists only in my own perverse imagination. Such things could never happen in real life. A comfort, even when I come to doubt my own sanity. For what sane person could ever imagine these things? But the nightmare is only a nightmare. In waking reality, there's a life to be lived, friends, family, passion for astronomy, and a love for horseback riding in the country. I set up shop as a horse trainer, a teenage girl's dream job. I figure I'll learn the business on the fly, and so I do. And then the job of a lifetime comes my way. At 14 years old, I'm given the task of getting a prize-winning Appaloosa stallion in shape for the Fort Worth Stock Show. And so begins my weekly trek out to the farm where Lord Orion holds court. A drive that's pleasant enough even without the fairy tale destination. I revel in the power of the ancient caddy that my mother bought me as a learner car. Bigger is safer, she said. But I'm still a year away from being eligible for a learner's permit. I'm 14 years old. So I avoid the main highways, choosing instead the back roads and the farm extensions. And so I gain a renewed appreciation for the unsung beauty of the Texas Hill Country. And then one day on my drive in the country, a song heard by chance we call it, on the radio brings me face to face with my unremembered past. A melody from beyond any dream or nightmare flows from the old caddy's excellent sound system. And suddenly I'm in the place from before the nightmares. My hand caresses salt sea, chasing tiny fish, as waves stain my rolled up trousers and a woman's voice sings of loves lost or never won. Too soon the music ends. A perky voice chimes in over the last notes, unforgivably spoiling the mood and bringing me back to the smell of pecan trees and the Texas springtime. That's all for this week's Jewish Music Hall. Join us Tuesday for our annual fundraising drive. Come out and show your support. Numbly, I memorized the number to call to volunteer. I have to find the name of that song. Some part of me was stolen somewhere, sometime, and that song is a clue. And so Tuesday morning finds me in Dallas, having braved the perils of the Texas Highway Patrol in pursuit of a song. I make new friends, some of whom invite me to visit the new Jewish Community Center in Fort Worth. But I'm not Jewish, I say. Still, I begin to read and to question. I'm not Jewish, am I? More reading, and there seems to be, yes, perhaps I am after all. Something deep inside breathes this sigh of relief, a murmur of resignation, a hint of sorrow and fear, and a hope so shocking in its raw pain that it must be shut out completely. But another voice whispers quietly in my ear, "Welcome home. I've missed you." The Orthodox conversion 2 years down the line will be merely the rubber stamp on a choice that was never really a choice. And so I set out on a treasure hunt to find that missing part of myself, stolen by something somewhere and hidden in a song. I travel to Poland and find where the story ended. A desolate field, the buildings from my nightly ramblings revealed in all their sordid reality. I retreat inside myself, cowering in the tour bus. "Take me home," I whisper, knowing that in this place no prayers are answered. But now finally, there's an answering voice. "Come home." The next summer, I'm on my way to Israel to start a new life, aged 18, $200 in my pocket, and a remembered concentration camp number in my head. On the bus to the Western Wall, I again hear that song from my youth, and something in me dances, soars to the heavens, and plummets in blind despair at love betrayed. Bewildered, I journey on. My travels take me to a Shabbat dinner hosted by a rabbi who teaches at a local seminary. Together with a dozen young people from all over the world, I celebrate Shabbat as it's meant to be celebrated, with wine and song and stories. And before I know it, I'm speaking of my hopes and fears freely before this crowd of strangers. "Would you three be willing to come back after Havdalah to help me with a project?" asks the rabbi. And so the next evening, I present myself at the rabbi's house. The Shabbat table is now cleared of food and cheer. The room seems darker, more somber, as I trail after the other two guests to an inner room and sit down in the rabbi's study. He brings out an index file, pulls a card from a stack, and asks a few questions. When did you first realize? How did you know? Why did you decide to make your home in Israel? And we answer, each of us, in halting, bewildered wonderment at the turn our lives have taken. We are aware that we are witnesses to a promise made long ago and now kept, living receptacles of memories that we could not have lived. Are all of those cards filled with such memories and such stories, I ask? Indeed they are, says the rabbi. You see, at the yeshiva, we get a lot of people passing through. Some come for a week or a month. Others stay and learn and raise families. And every year we get a few who describe their journeys much as you three did last night. Vague dreams or nightmares, a sense of completing someone else's life. Let's just say that I know why people like you are here. This index file here, this is a record of a miracle that is happening in our day, right now, all around us. He pauses and glances keenly at each of us. Then, in a voice filled with wonder, he says, "We in our generation, we are witnessing Tchiyat HaMetim, the revival of the dead, and I am keeping a record." The revival of the dead, what does it mean? Research has shown that traumatic memory tends to move from private experience to public awareness only in the third generation, as those who physically endured the events finally begin to open up and tell what they experienced. Might it be the same with inherited memory? Perhaps such memories are simply the way communities preserve the immediacy of experience as an aid to survival. If so, then such memories follow any communal trauma. The difference is that all past pogroms and expulsions were more local, and hence the incidence of inherited memory would be less noticeable. What's different this time is the sheer scale of it. In the wake of the Shoah, the phenomenon is too big to ignore. Practically every person you talk to in Israel remembers something, and many remember far more than they would like to. The peoples whose story appear in Sara's book appear to be merely the tip of the iceberg. But how could it be otherwise? Never before have we seen so many people die in so horrendous a fashion, often having been forced by circumstances to transgress their most deeply held principles. Mothers forced to choose which of their children would live. Fathers forced to decide which of their sons had the best chance of survival. These choices can't help but scar us, not only as individuals, but as a people. Every act, every word, perhaps even every thought, enters our national consciousness, and it's there for each of us to access, consciously or not. And so, all unwittingly, we become repositories of living memory. We remember those things that, if forgotten, endanger all that we hold dear. Is the persuasiveness of these memories and the pervasiveness of these memories merely a matter of our being more open to believing these things now? Or is it that the enormity of the trauma of the Shoah left so many souls in need of a tikkun that there was simply no way we could forget, even if we wanted to? Could the rabbi in Jerusalem have been right that this mass remembering is in fact the prophesied revival of the dead? Regardless of how the memory came to me, I see it as a message in a bottle, somehow smuggled out by someone who didn't believe that anyone would be left to tell the tale, someone whose only way of getting the message out was to etch it into the psyche of the bottle. It certainly explains the odd course my life has taken. I've spent most of my adult life working in security and intelligence, preventing bad things from happening to good people, while actively making sure that bad things did happen to bad people. But more, I was constantly volunteering for hazard pay. Why this need to throw myself into dangerous situations, to put myself in the line of fire, to tempt fate? Even in the IDF reserves, I sought out positions that involve personal risk. An attempt to resolve something, an attempt to atone. But to atone for what? Well, it turns out that there was indeed something in me needed to atone for. I've written about that journey of discovery in my book, Returning, and it's a story of redemption against all odds, of humanity in the face of soul-numbing despair, and of friendship in the heart of hell. It's a testimony to the triumph of the human heart over its own weakness, the final proof that even death is no barrier to the soul in need of redemption. Such stories resonate with us because all of us here today are living evidence of the revival of a people from the ashes. Despite the worst they could do to us, we're still here, not merely surviving, but thriving, not merely living, but celebrating life. We are, all of us, proof of the revival of the dead.
Thank you, Yael. You are invited to stay on for our Q&A, but we will now conclude the main part of our program by reciting Shema Yisrael. Shema Yisrael is the credo of our faith, and it is recited twice daily and also at the time of death. One of the few surviving Sandra commandos in Auschwitz told Rabbi Shlomo Wolbe that when the doors to the gas chambers closed and the gas started to come out, whether the transport was from a religious or secular Jewish community, he always heard the screams of Shema Yisrael. Shema Yisrael, Adonai Eloheinu, Adonai Echad. Now we are ready to address some questions. Our first question comes from David in Toronto. How do I know if I am a soul from the Holocaust? Sara, can you answer that, please?
The hundreds and hundreds of people that I worked with in my research, and hundreds more have been coming out of the woodwork since my book came out, all had one thing in common. Everybody had a very unique experience, but they all had one thing in common. That was an obsession with the Holocaust. Now, an obsession with the Holocaust manifests in one of two ways. In one way, the person is obsessed, they have to read every book and see every movie and just know everything about the Holocaust. And the other way is the opposite. They cannot see anything, read anything. If they go to a Holocaust museum, they have a panic attack. So complete cutoff. But the Holocaust is always their obsession. That is, I think, the telltale sign of being a soul from the Holocaust. However, I want to make this very clear. You do not have to know what your past lifetime was. Because whatever you have to do tikkun on, God will give you the situation, the people, whatever it is that you will be confronted with, whatever you need to be confronted with in order to do your tikkun in this lifetime. So please don't walk away from this program thinking, oh, what was I in my past lifetime? No, walk away from this program thinking, what's my tikkun?
Thank you. Our next question from Naomi in Los Angeles is for Yael. Why did you need atonement and how did you achieve it?
So when I first realized I was walking around with someone else's memories in my head, first of all, I thought I was crazy. But when I started doing some research, I thought it was only 2 months worth. That's what I remembered, 2 months worth. But then why was this guilt? Why this overwhelming guilt that I felt? So it turns out that I had notebooks going back decades that I had found, that I'd torn out pages where I'd written down certain memories. It was something that I was hiding from myself, some dark secret. And when I finally began opening up to the memories, I finally understood that I had not 2 months worth, but 1 year and 7 months worth of memory. And it's what well, pronouns get a bit weird here because obviously it wasn't me, but evidently what I had been doing had been something that I would be ashamed of to do, at least in that time with the upbringing that I had at that point. And the memories were those of working in the crematorium, Birkenau. And there were vivid, vivid memories, soul-searing memories of violating my own deepest principles. And so I took my case to a rabbi, and of course, I'm cutting the story very, very short because this unfolded over many years. I took my case to a rabbi and I put myself on trial. And instead of saying you're guilty or you're innocent or whatever, he said, we're going to work together on this. And we worked together for years for me to reach a point where I could own those memories and where I could turn it around and become someone who wouldn't make the same mistakes again, or at least I hope that I wouldn't. And what I learned in those years of studies is that it really is never too late to become the person that you should have been. My mother used to say, it's never too late to have a happy childhood. And I'm learning is that it's never too late to become the person that you should have been. No matter how deeply you've sunk into the mud of your experiences and no matter how much of a failure you feel yourself to be, you can always turn it around and you can always return to who you should have been.
Thank you. Our third question comes from Joseph in New York for Sara. Sara, what is your particular memory?
My particular memory, I was born to second-generation American parents in the Philadelphia area who had really no connection with the Holocaust, but I was, from the womb, I was obsessed with the Holocaust, this tremendous hatred of everything German. And when I was 14 years old, I'm like, as a kid, I wouldn't buy a German product or take a ride in a Volkswagen, and, like really seething hatred of everything German, which I thought until I was in 3rd grade of Hebrew school, I thought that all Jewish kids felt like I did. And I was shocked when I found out that that wasn't the case. But anyway, when I was 14 years old and starting high school, and we had to pick a foreign language, all my friends chose French or Spanish, and I chose German. And everybody was like, what? You hate Germans. And I said, oh, I have to learn to read Mein Kampf in the original. I was so obsessed. And a week into learning German, 1 week into German classes, I woke up one night like, I had had a dream in fluent German. And I was like, what? I had no concept, of course, of reincarnation at that point. And I couldn't understand what it was, but it totally freaked me out. The dream was in fluent German. And then when I was coming back from India, when I was 21 years old, this was in 1969, I was on a flight. I needed to fly from Tel Aviv to Stockholm. And the airline the airline was Pan Am, which doesn't exist anymore. But then I had a round the world Pan Am ticket. And the airline wanted to put me, change planes in Frankfurt. I said, I'm not going to Germany, never. And so they booked me through Vienna instead. And I had a 7-hour layover in Vienna. And I went into a residential section of, residential neighborhood of Vienna. I was walking around. I was, a 21-year-old college student, and I had a book about what to look at for different societies have different cultural things you like notice when you're in different countries. And suddenly I had a panic attack and a flashback. Flashback, as I said, something that's not like something in your head, like suddenly you're reliving the experience. It was absolutely frightening. And I realized from that, this is what is going on is too real. And that was what got me started to realize that I must have been there in the Holocaust.
Thank you, Sara. Our final question from Miriam in Chicago is for both Yael and Sara. Why do you see this as revival of the dead, Tchiyat HaMeitim? Yael?
Okay, so the concept of the revival of dead has been cropping up in Jewish traditions in a lot of different guises. For the prophets, it was a metaphor for the resurrection of the Jewish nation, politically, religiously, and culturally. And during the long exile, when the possibility of political and national resurrection seemed to be receding into the distant future, it came to be more of an individual thing, a personal resurrection, either metaphorical or literal. But it crops up in our liturgy. We say it 3 times a day. We praise God who keeps faith with those who sleep in the dust, which could be either agricultural or it could be personal. And we express gratitude to God for reviving the dead with mercy. But none of this has any timeline. It's not put in the part of the prayer where we thank God for the revival or we ask for the revival of the nation at some point. And that led some of our sages, the Rambam evidently among them, to assume that the revival of the dead isn't confined to any particular time. It can happen at any time and perhaps even happens all the time. And yet it would seem that the individual revival is still bound up in some ways with the revival of the Jewish nation. And the two are linked by this concept of returning, of tikkun, of self-healing. And in our day, we're actually seeing both types of revival. The Jewish nation is being rebuilt by people who are often themselves returning in ways they may never be able to put a name to. But Jewish tradition does have a name for it, and we call it Tchiyat HaMeitim, the revival of the dead.
Thank you.
So my concept of Tchiyat HaMeitim, the revival of the dead, is very different from Yael's. That's one of the great things about Judaism. Two Jews, 3 opinions, so there are many different perspectives, and all of them add something to the whole picture. So what I have learned, the Tchiyat HaMeitim refers to a period of time that comes after the Messianic era. Many of us here in Israel feel like the Messianic era is coming very fast toward us. Just all the things happening in the world and all the miracles that we see in Israel and have seen since 1948, 1967, and the Gulf War and everything we see, Mamash, the hand of God. And I personally, I want to say, I'm not going to generalize to a great degree, but I see that the Messianic era is coming fast and furiously. And according to what I have learned, which is also standard traditional Judaism, is that after the Messianic era that was prophesied by the prophets, then this period of Tchiyat HaMeitim happens, the revival of the dead, where it's explained, that because Judaism, and this is an important point, we think of Abraham, the patriarch, as having introduced monotheism to the world. He didn't introduce monotheism to the world. There were monotheists, there were people who knew there was one God before Abraham. But what he did introduce into the world is the idea that the physical world is not something to be left behind while we elevate ourselves spiritually and go up spiritually. Like the physical world is something that's, you know, sinful and icky and you know, we got to leave it behind. That's the Jewish concept, and this is integral to Judaism, is that no, the physical world can be sanctified through the performance of mitzvot and through using the physical world in a certain way. We elevate the physical world again. We don't leave it behind. So Teaneck Amesim means that the body is not a terrible thing. It's not like ick, you know, sinful, horrible. You know, we don't need it. We need it. And so at the time of Teaneck Amesim, somehow the soul comes back into the physical body, and but not the physical body that we know, not this one, like what they call light bodies. And I have no idea what that means.
Okay, thank you. Thank you all for participating. We hope that you've gained some insight into the vast scope of Holocaust memory. For anyone who is interested in buying Sara's or Yael's books or contacting the speakers through their websites, all the information appears on the screen in front of you. And again, thank you for joining us tonight.